when 18-year-old Valaine Briggs left her Salt Lake City apartment and walked to class one spring morning in 1977. Her carefully planned future was full of promise. Though she was in a time of transition and had recently ended an engagement, Valaine knew that even this temporary disappointment brought her closer to the life she dreamed of. A life full of family and rooted in faith. A life her ex-fiancé could not provide. What Valaine could not have known that morning was that her postcard-perfect future would be stolen from her in the cruelest of ways. It was midday on May 5, 1977, when Moana was waiting for her roommate Valaine to return from her morning class so they could go shopping together. Valaine had left their apartment around 9:30 that morning for the short walk to the LDS Business College, where she was studying for a certificate in court reporting. Her class only ran until 11:20, and she and Moana had plans to visit the Crossroads Mall in downtown Salt Lake City after Valaine returned home. The walk should have taken only 10 minutes, but 11:30 came and went with no sign of Valaine. As the minutes stretched into hours, Moana's initial frustration gave way to concern, a feeling shared by their other roommates. Unified Police Detective Ben Pender, the cold case detective who has been working this case since 2015, explained that the roommates were genuinely worried because Valaine was extremely reliable about informing them of her whereabouts and expected return times. However, the roommates were not yet ready to involve law enforcement in the early afternoon. Instead, they called Valaine's ex-fiancé Scott to see if he knew where she was. He did not, and recognizing that something was wrong, he came to their apartment and remained with her roommates until approximately 1 or 2 in the morning. The roommates' decision to involve Scott made sense for several reasons. First, they had only been completely broken up for a few days. Second, Valaine was not from Utah but from Dillon, Montana, as was Scott. He knew Valaine's parents and how to contact them. They placed a long-distance call to her parents, hoping they might have heard from her, but learned that her parents had not been in contact with her either. Valaine's parents then contacted her uncle Elwood, who lived locally in Utah, and asked him to file a missing persons report, which he did at 11:15 p.m. Scott spoke with police either that night or early the next morning to support the uncle's concerns. He told police that he had not spoken to Valaine since late on May 4th, specifically around 11:00 p.m. on Wednesday, May 4th, 1977. Scott explained that he and Valaine had officially ended their engagement approximately 3 weeks prior, but had continued seeing each other. It was not until the May 4th phone call that they definitively ended their relationship, and he admitted it had not concluded well. Valaine was crying and hung up on him. When investigators asked about the reason for their breakup, they learned that Valaine was a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and had been trying to convert Scott to her faith. Scott had shown resistance to this conversion, and over time, they had drifted apart due to this fundamental difference. Valaine wanted religious compatibility in her marriage, while Scott did not share this desire. Initially, there were no immediate red flags for police. They suspected she might simply be upset about her breakup and needed time to recover. The prevailing attitude at the time was that if an adult was missing, authorities should wait a few days to see if they returned on their own, rather than immediately launching an investigation. Despite this casual approach, which was not unique to Salt Lake City or the 1970s, the Salt Lake City Police Department actually began a strong investigative effort on May 6th. They issued a bulletin to nearby law enforcement agencies about Valaine's disappearance and visited the LDS Business College to confirm she had attended class the previous day. Several witnesses confirmed that Valaine had attended class. One individual had walked with her down the stairs at the end of class, and when they reached the bottom, the classmate went in one direction, while Valaine went another. They parted ways at that point, and this appeared to be the last confirmed sighting of her. It seemed as though she had walked down those stairs, said her goodbyes, and simply vanished. This disappearance occurred in the middle of the day from a building on a busy road surrounded by houses and businesses, making it puzzling that no one had witnessed anything unusual. Police began canvassing the area, checking hospitals, cab companies, and bus companies, but none could confirm seeing Valaine. Her doctor was contacted and confirmed he had not seen her since a previous visit in March. Officers went door to door in Valaine's neighborhood, showing residents her photograph and asking if anyone had seen her the day before, but these efforts proved fruitless. By May 7th, when Valaine had been missing for 2 days, her parents had driven down from Montana to Salt Lake City. When they met with Salt Lake police, They emphasized several critical points about their daughter's character. The family firmly believed that Valaine would never have gotten into a vehicle, whether by force or fear, without putting up tremendous resistance. They described her as not easily intimidated, very athletic, and someone who would never solicit rides or act in a carefree manner. They characterized her as reserved and shy around people she did not know well, rather than being a wild type of person. Valaine's friends and even her ex-fiancé Scott agreed with this assessment. Since Scott was possibly the person who knew her best, they had been planning to marry just weeks earlier. Investigators decided to interview him again for additional insights into Valaine's life. This second interview was supposed to be routine, but Scott's story changed somewhat from his initial account. He now claimed that the last time he spoke to Valaine was around 7:00 p.m. on May 3rd, rather than closer to midnight on May 4th. This discrepancy was puzzling, as confusing specific times like 7:00 p.m. and 11:00 p.m. seemed more unusual than mixing up days. What also seemed odd was Scott's activities the day after Valaine disappeared. He had contacted his father, who drove down from Dillon, Montana, and they began searching for Valaine in the canyons. Scott described their search efforts as going pretty crazy about it. When asked why he would search the canyons, Scott replied that if something had happened to her, she would probably end up in a canyon. While this statement was not entirely unreasonable, a young woman's body had been found in the canyons just a year prior. It seemed that while everyone else in Valaine's life was hoping she was safe, Scott was immediately considering the possibility of murder. Scott maintained his innocence regarding Valaine's disappearance and provided an alibi to investigators. He claimed to have been working at a local hotel where he was employed as a cook from 11:00 a.m. to 7:00 p.m. on May 5th, and his supervisor confirmed this schedule. When asked to take a polygraph, he declined, though many people refuse such tests. Perhaps Scott's changing story and focus on the canyons were innocent, after all, though that assessment might change upon learning where Valaine was found that very day. The sheriff's office had been dispatched that evening to a brutal scene in a nearby canyon. Around 6:00 p.m., they received a report from 4 teenage hikers who had discovered a woman's nude body in Lamb's Canyon. The boys had returned to one of their homes, debated whether they might somehow be blamed for the discovery, and ultimately decided they had to alert authorities. A detective picked up the 4 teenagers and transported them back to Lamb's Canyon, where they led him directly to their gruesome discovery. At the bottom of a steep hill near a stream, they found a woman curled in the fetal position. Her hands were bound together with what appeared to be a lady's stocking, as were her ankles. All 4 limbs were then bound together with what looked like a black belt decorated with flowers. There was a mark on her neck, approximately 1/8 of an inch wide, extending from behind both ears across the front of the neck and around to the back, which was very light and possibly indicated pressure applied from behind, suggesting strangulation with a cord or rope. There was bruising on Valaine's left shoulder and smaller bruises on her back. Sexual assault was immediately suspected based on the presence and location of blood on her body, as well as the obvious fact that she had been disrobed. Strangely, there were marks on her arms near her elbows, suggesting to investigators that she may have been bound in a different position before being left there with her wrists and ankles tied. The body did not appear to have been there very long, and it seemed as though she had been restrained in other locations on her body, indicating she may have been moved after death or taken to this location to be murdered. Scattered nearby, up to approximately 30 feet away, were what investigators assumed were the deceased woman's belongings: shoes, clothing including jeans, blouse, jacket, bra, and underwear, as well as textbooks, a notepad, and keys. The items appeared to have been tossed down into the ravine from the road above due to their scattered distribution. Investigators suspected this might be Valaine Briggs because they had received the Salt Lake City Police Department's missing person bulletin just days earlier. Their suspicions were confirmed when they discovered that some of the discarded textbooks bore inscriptions with her name. A positive identification was still required, so the remains were transported by ambulance to the medical examiner's office at the University of Utah Medical Center. The next morning, Valaine's uncle Elwood was brought in for the devastating task of confirming the victim's identity. An autopsy was performed on May 8th, determining the cause and manner of death to be homicide by ligature strangulation. Detectives speculated that a cord or rope had been used, and the medical examiner confirmed initial suspicions of sexual assault. though all swabs taken during the examination were negative for semen. Because Valaine's body was found outside the jurisdiction of the Salt Lake City Police Department, which had been handling her missing person case, responsibility for investigating her homicide fell to the Salt Lake County Sheriff's Office. The two agencies coordinated the following day, and the investigation was officially transferred. The Sheriff's Office began contacting neighbors at the apartment complex and conducting neighborhood canvasses in the area where Valaine lived, speaking with both roommates and classmates. One name that repeatedly came up was an older neighbor who lived in their building, referred to as Fred, who made the young women feel very uncomfortable. Fred was known to drink heavily and become vulgar and loud. According to Valaine's roommates, he would leer at the women when they walked by and would even catcall them. He was simply someone who made them all uncomfortable with his comments and the way he watched them. Fred immediately appeared suspicious. When investigators interviewed him on May 10th, he had no alibi for the day Valaine went missing. He claimed to have been home alone all day on May 5th. Fred also had an extensive criminal history that raised red flags. At 65 years old, Fred had a criminal record including child molestation, assault, larceny, DUI, and forgery. The fact that he had a history of sexual offenses was particularly concerning given the nature of Valaine's murder. Despite his extensive criminal background, Fred was surprisingly cooperative with investigators. When they asked for permission to search his truck camper, he granted it, and they discovered that he kept rope there. When given permission to search his apartment, they found something even more suspicious: women's underwear in his garbage. Investigators found 4 pairs of women's panties in the living room and a dish towel in a trunk, also in the living room. These items were collected as evidence. Since Valaine's underwear was found near her body, investigators did not necessarily think the ones from Fred's apartment belonged to her. But this raised questions about whose they were. Frustratingly, while Detective Pender noted that Fred provided some explanation for the underwear, this explanation is not documented in the case file. Whatever Fred's explanation was, he did not seem concerned about sharing it with investigators and even agreed to take a polygraph examination, which he passed. Fred also permitted investigators to take hair samples for comparison with strands found at the scene. However, with the technology available in the 1970s, investigators had exhausted their options with Fred. They had no other evidence indicating his involvement. He had cooperated throughout, and the polygraph results suggested his innocence. Fortunately, Fred was not the only suspect. Another name kept appearing in interviews with both Valaine's roommates and classmates: Richard, a professor at the LDS Business College, whose real name has been concealed at Detective Pender's request. Richard worked during the day in the courts doing court reporting and taught evening classes at the LDS Business College. He seemed to have taken a particular interest in Valaine that other students noticed, and it appeared he was crossing professional boundaries. Investigators learned that Richard had a habit of visiting Valaine at the ice cream shop where she worked and had called her at her apartment several times. When questioned about his relationship with Valaine, Richard claimed it was strictly a teacher-student relationship and denied ever attempting to date her. Earning his phone calls to her apartment, Richard claimed he was verifying assignments he had given to the class, suggesting he had forgotten what he had assigned. This explanation seemed odd, as it would be unusual for a teacher to call a student to ask what assignment had been given. Not all of their conversations were strictly professional. Richard acknowledged that he and Valaine had discussed her engagement to Scott on several occasions, sometimes at length. She had kept him informed of their evolving relationship status: engaged, not engaged, but still seeing each other, and finally completely broken up. Richard was only 24 at the time, but was still her professor and was married with a toddler at home, making his interest in Valaine inappropriate. When investigators asked about his whereabouts on May 5th, he provided what seemed to be a solid alibi, claiming he was at work in his day job as a court reporter. Although his schedule depended on the court calendar, which could have last-minute cancellations, investigators appeared to accept his alibi at face value. They never searched his property or asked for permission to do so, and they never requested that he take a polygraph examination. By June of that year, investigators sent approximately 20 pieces of evidence to the FBI crime lab in Washington, D.C. for processing. The FBI found 62 latent fingerprints and 3 latent palm prints on various items found near Valaine's body, sending back a report documenting these findings. However, this was before the automated fingerprint identification system, FIS, and these prints were never entered into databases. No one has been able to locate them since. The FBI either lost them, misplaced them, or they may have been lost in transit. Detective Pender has had FBI personnel searching for them for years without success. Hair strands obtained from neighbor Fred were also sent to the FBI for processing, but nothing significant resulted from this testing. While the hair evidence from the scene was too limited to be of much comparative value, investigators felt confident that it did not appear to match Fred's samples. After exhausting these leads, the case slowed down significantly. Then something bizarre occurred in Montana, near Valaine's hometown, that reignited interest in the case. In July 1977, a 17-year-old girl hitchhiking in Montana was found to be carrying Valaine's identification. The circumstances were remarkable because this hitchhiker was near Dillon, where Valaine was from, and when she showed the ID to the driver who had stopped for her, he immediately recognized the name. Valaine was a hometown girl whose death had received local media attention, so as soon as the driver dropped off the hitchhiker, he reported the incident to local law enforcement. Authorities were able to locate the girl and bring her in for extensive questioning. This was not a minor informal interview. They questioned this girl for days. According to reporting in the Montana Standard from July 1977, officials even allowed Valaine's family to question her at length. However, any possible connection proved fleeting. The identification was determined to be fake, obtained from someone in Salt Lake City who manufactured false IDs. Valaine's name had apparently been chosen from her newspaper obituary. After this incident, Valaine's case went completely cold for years. Starting in 1983, the investigation took a detour when Henry Lee Lucas and Otis Toole began confessing to numerous unsolved cold cases across the continental United States. However, these confessions proved unreliable and led nowhere. Investigators also considered other serial killers, including Ted Bundy, but were unable to establish any connections between these suspects and Valaine's murder. Not much occurred in Valaine's case until 2014, when cold case investigators obtained permission to conduct a pharo scan of the location where her body was found. This 3D reality capture technology quickly captures every detail of a crime scene for investigation, reconstruction, and legal prosecution, though its practical application 37 years after the fact remains unclear. More significantly, in 2014, several pieces of evidence were submitted for advanced forensic testing and returned unknown mixed DNA profiles, specifically 2 or more unknown mixed male profiles. The significance of these findings is not entirely clear. Detective Pender notes that evidence collection techniques in 1977 did not preclude the possibility of investigators inadvertently depositing their own DNA onto items from the scene. One or more of these profiles could potentially belong to investigators. Unfortunately, current technology cannot fully isolate the profiles. However, these DNA profiles have already provided critical breakthroughs for Valaine's case. The current DNA evidence is sufficient to exclude suspects, and investigators are working to exclude or include everyone initially considered involved in the case. They have successfully ruled out 2 initial persons of interest through DNA comparison: neighbor Fred and teacher Richard, both of whom are now deceased. When asked whether Scott, the ex-fiancé who is still alive, has been similarly excluded, Detective Pender became evasive and would not provide a direct answer. This reluctance seems significant, given that Pender has been working this case since 2015. When asked what he believes happened to Valaine, Detective Pender noted that she was only a 7 to 9 minute walk from her residence and had no reason to accept a ride unless it was from someone she knew or trusted. He believes it was someone she knew or was acquainted with to the point where she felt comfortable getting into a vehicle. Detective Pender also believes Valaine was held somewhere between her disappearance and the discovery of her body. The evidence suggests she was taken somewhere else initially, whether in a vehicle or to another building or residence. It appears she was bound in other locations on her body before being found bound differently, indicating something else occurred that investigators have not yet fully understood. Although no one has successfully isolated the DNA profiles, Detective Pender is confident this will change. The investigation remains active, with laboratory techniques evolving and new options becoming available. Investigators are exploring whether they can separate the DNA mixtures to conduct Y-star surname searches or obtain sufficient DNA for investigative genetic genealogy. Detective Pender is certain he will not give up on the case, believing that technological advancements will eventually provide solutions. He remains hopeful that current evidence will yield results, and if not immediately, then perhaps within 1 or 2 years. As long as evidence exists and investigative options remain, he maintains optimism about eventually solving the case. The murder of Valaine Briggs remains an active investigation more than 4 decades after her death. At only 18 years old, with her entire life ahead of her, Valaine was robbed of the future she had carefully planned and dreamed of pursuing. Her case represents not only a personal tragedy for her family and friends, but also demonstrates the evolution of forensic science and investigative techniques over the decades. The investigation has revealed the challenges faced by law enforcement in 1977, when DNA testing was unavailable and fingerprint databases were not computerized. It also highlights how cases can be revitalized through technological advances and the dedication of cold case investigators who refuse to abandon victims and their families. Detective Pender's commitment to finding justice for Valaine exemplifies the ongoing efforts of law enforcement to solve historical cases using modern techniques. The presence of DNA evidence, even in mixed profiles, offers hope that emerging technologies will eventually provide the breakthrough needed to identify her killer. Valaine's story serves as a reminder that victims of violent crime are never forgotten, and that the pursuit of justice continues regardless of how much time has passed. Her family and the community continue to await answers about what happened to this promising young woman, whose life was cut tragically short on that spring day in 1977. The case remains open and active, with investigators continuing to explore new avenues and technologies that may finally bring resolution to one of Utah's longest-standing unsolved murders. Until that day comes, Valaine Briggs' memory endures, and the search for justice in her name continues.